Hey everybody, Cybertal back with you. I like my new hat. We're continuing with our examination of hanging pawns. We're stepping into the review phase. We're going to start with the review of how to fight with the hanging pawns on your side. I'm going to take the first game as an opportunity to sort of examine one of the concepts that didn't really fit easily and thematically in a full examination because it is such a rare concept, but I think it is important to have the idea on board, and that's we've looked at hanging pawns when they advance being a weakness, like if you're able to force the C or the D pawn to advance and then essentially blockade the hanging pawns. We saw that through the lens of being a weakness. We saw advancing the D pawn as being a strength when you just push the D pawn forward, and that ends up being a very strong passed pawn. But we didn't really have a chance to examine the concept of advancing the C pawn, and that ending up not necessarily being a catastrophic weakness. It is a fairly rare concept, and typically when you advance your C pawn, you're more likely to come a cropper, because that does end up being a weakness that is blockadable. But there are some good examples of when it is not a weakness, where the C pawn just gobbles up space, and it's a strength in itself. One such example, this is the game also Bernstein against Jose Raul Capablanca. It's 1914, so Bernstein was white. E6, Bishop G5. In the early days of Queen's Gambit theory, this move was not a given. In fact, Steinitz did a lot of work with Bishop F4. He was sort of the early founder of that line. And then Karpov and Korchnoi sort of advanced the theory of that in the 70s suddenly. But Bishop G5, as soon as Harry Nelson Pillsbury got a hold of that move, he turned that into just a feared attacking weapon, and that's really been the main line ever since. It's funny to look back on commentary from, this game was back in 1914. This position, especially after the Capablanca-Alekhine match, they start to talk about a drawing death in chess, just because most of the games featured this position or a derivation of this position. It didn't even occur to them to just play different openings. Castle, knight bd7, so this is the main line, of course. This is featured in literally tens of thousands of games. There's three main moves branching off from here. Bernstein played rook c1. Bishop d3, if my memory serves right, is the third most popular option. This is very common, but it's my least favorite. So basically, in any Queen's Gambit position, you see the c-pawn featuring in a battle of the tempo. So white tries not to move this light square bishop immediately, or else black can take on c4 and force that light square bishop to lose a move. So a lot of times you'll see white delaying moving that bishop on f1 as much as possible and finding other useful moves to make in the meantime. Black holds off on taking on c4, because if he did it now, white could simply take back in one move and he doesn't lose the time. So there's this miniature battle of the tempo that often results between the two sides in a position like this. Bishop d3 just immediately skips the battle of the tempo and just gets on with development, but I don't like it. I think the battle for the tempo is important to a certain extent. And a6 is the best move here. This is simply, I would prefer black here, actually. This is like a supercharged Slav. Because in positions like this, usually black has to play moves like c6 and a6 and then b5 and then and only then c5. But black is just doing this all so efficiently. He's going to play b5. He's going to play c5 in one move. This is all happening very efficiently for black. Plus, he won that tempo off of white. So objectively, this is probably just equal, but subjectively, I prefer black because his play is so easy from here. Most dangerous option, in my opinion, this is the Rubenstein Attack. Yet another part of modern theory that was just completely invented by Akiba Rubenstein. Essentially, the idea white holds his rook in flexibility. Sometimes this will matter if white decides to castle queenside and just go for an all-out kingside attack. So queen c2 in some ways is the most aggressive option against this line of the Queen's Gambit declined. c5, in my opinion, is the most logical move because the downside is white is putting this queen on a c-file that might end up being exposed, so immediately black tries to open up that c-file. The other option, c6, in my opinion, at the very worst, white can just transpose to, in my opinion, a favorable Queen's Gambit exchange variation. So this is sort of position, if you play the Queen's Gambit as white, you should be heavy milking all day. C5 is the most logical in my opinion. One such line. And this is a small edge for whites. White's bishop on d3 is better than black's bishop on c8. White's managed to get 2 sets of minor pieces off the board, so if we head towards a hanging pawn or an isolated pawn position, that tends to be a little bit more favorable to the side playing against the pawn structure. But black is super solid from here. In modern Grandmaster play, black tends to hold the draw here, but white wins just enough to keep white interested in playing this line. So, 3 viable options. Rook c1 is probably would be my choice in modern chess, just because it keeps more pieces on the board and leads to more complexity, but it's just a matter of taste. b6. With modern eyes, this move just doesn't seem right. It's still played, but black doesn't score terribly well. We see c6 as just being much more logical. So the rook comes to the c file, so it sort of makes sense that we immediately barricade part of the c file. We keep the battle of the tempo brewing. One modern main line, knight d5. This is a relieving maneuver invented by Capablanca. Black's just looking to get some minor pieces off the board to ameliorate his deficit in space. Again, very small edge for white, but black is very solid here. If you're playing the Queen's Gambit inclined as black, you should be prepared and be happy to play a defensive position like this. It's not all excitement. b6 just creates... It looks awkward because it creates a complex of light-squared weaknesses on the queen side. So if that bishop on c8 were to somehow disappear, suddenly all those squares on the queen side are completely undefended, and it's viable to occupy them. Bernstein takes, that's correct. Queen a4. It's not mandatory, it's a logical move. White could just continue with development. Bishop f5. So this is a key reorganizational move that white very often chooses in these structures. So the bishop on d3, it looks nice, but in the play to come against the hanging pawn structure, the bishop on d3 just doesn't really do anything. It's not pointed against the hanging pawns. It's pointed against the king side, but white's play is most likely not going to be on the king side. So bishop f5 is a valuable reorganization move. It could just chop on d7 and give itself up to get one of black's knights off the board. It could also drop back to h3. White could play g3 and then bishop g2. That's sort of a long-form reorganizational idea that we see sometimes as well. So bishop f5, very clever move. White does have a small edge here. It's nothing terrible, but black did go for this structure a little bit too quickly with that b6 move. But queen a4 is perfectly logical. b7. C5 was the choice of Lasker against Capablanca in their 1921 World Championship match. Bishop b5 is best. Queen c6 was the choice in the match. But this is a very dangerous pawn to grab. Probably my favorite line is to take on d4. This is just an example line. The rest of the notes you can look at. As usual, I'll have the annotated PGN file in the comments. And black has excellent compensation for the pawn. This king stuck on e1 is a serious deficit for white. It's hard for white to get castled because that bishop on b7 is so strong. Black has full compensation for the pawn, at least. I would subjectively prefer black here, because initiative is quite serious. So that's a dangerous pawn to grab. Bishop b5 is most likely better. This is just one example line. And white has a small edge because the c-pawn is a little bit weak. And it's not likely that the c-pawn is going to get pushed down the board just because white has good control over it. That said, this is still well within the drawing margin. Black should hold this with a correct play, most likely. Bishop b7 was played instead of c5, a little bit passive. Bishop a6, completely correct. So what we said about that colored complex in the queen side, white in some ways does this in the most efficient way, because black played bishop b7 first, then and only then do we play bishop a6 in one move. So you're getting black's piece off the board after it invests that move in moving to b7. So white actually saves some time this move and it creates those weaknesses on the queen side it can help exploit. So Bernstein actually has a very promising position here. c5, so we're headed for a hanging pawn structure. Whenever you're in a hanging pawn structure, typically if you're playing against the hanging pawns, take my cool hat off. If you're playing against the hanging pawns, if you can proactively get the bishop pair off the board, that makes things a lot easier. Here, black does not have the bishop pair, so it robs his hanging pawns of some of their dynamism. So white is certainly for choice here. This is a favorable hanging pawn structure. Bernstein takes an f6. This is just incorrect. There's no reason to gift Capablanca the bishop like that. Castle. Simple chess. When you can, finish your development and get castled, and then go from there. One example line. Queen c8. It's hard to do without this move just because this queen and a6 really paralyzes black. White always has a very simple threat of just like knight e5, knight c7, invading the queen side. And I don't want to overstate white's advantage. White's slightly better here. But this is a very comfortable position for white. White's playing for free here. The hanging pawns are a weakness here. Black doesn't have activity or space or anything for them. They're just pawn weaknesses. Now, they're defended for now, and black has decent mobilization. But those are passive achievements. White has all the play here because he's the one that's going to be setting the pace against pressuring those pawns. So again, I don't want to overstate white's advantage, but white is certainly for choice here. These unfavorable hanging pawns, just because, again, black doesn't have the sort of active play you want to be compensating for the hanging pawns. So bishop takes f6. There's no reason to give up the bishop like this. 5. It's no longer a good time to transition because black is actually doing well in mobilization. So there's more of a threat that black is actually going to be able to mobilize quickly and develop the pressure that you want for the hanging pawns. b3, it looks a little bit strange, but it prevents c4, which is a positional threat in some ways. Now we transition once the queens are off. And white has a little bit of something to work with. It's a little bit different from the last line because black has the bishop as a resource. So bishop versus knight in an ending tends to be a little bit better for the bishop. But white still has these pawns to play against. So this is probably a micro edge for white. With proper play, it should be perfectly fine for black, of course. But this is still something for white. Headed for the hanging pawns when you're behind in development, plus the queens you're still on, is definitely more dangerous. Queen b6. There's no reason to go into an endgame. Rook b8. Simple chess. Put your rooks on open files. Typically, when you can put a rook on an open file like this that's very active and attacks something, it's hard for it to be a wrong choice. One example line. h3. Black is doing perfectly fine here. Oh, black has very active play. d4 is a threat in some circumstances, just getting the pawn moving. Black can also just continue mobilization with stuff like rook b6 and then choose to maybe double the rooks behind the d-pawn or just continue with like queen b7 and continue to mobilize. Queen b6, there's no reason. When you have the hanging pawns, again, you want to develop active play. If you have hanging pawns and you're headed for an endgame, you want to be very, very sure that endgame is not just slightly worse for you. Because so often the hanging pawns, as soon as you reach that endgame, that's when playing against the hanging pawns becomes more of a treat, because you can develop that pressure that actually lasts. There's no counterplay, counterbalancing it. Queen e2, there's no reason to keep queens on. Just trade. Now this quote-unquote repairs the hanging pawns, because now there's a b-pawn supporting the c-pawn, but the d-pawn is still weak. It's still bereft of any pawn support, so that's still a target for white. And this is slightly better for white. White, his next move is to, either to probably just double on the d file would be the correct way forward. Also, he consider one of those knight maneuvers that we've been talking about in playing against the hanging pawns. Perhaps knight e5, threatening knight c6, and then knight d3, knight f4 to pressure the pawn on d5. But that d-pawn is certainly a target. White would be very happy to have this position. But queen e2, no reason to keep those on the board. And now the most controversial move of the game. c4. So, a lot of silly things have been said on both sides about this move. When I was growing up and I was reading instructional books, this move was given a double exclamation mark. It was just a move from beyond by an untouchable genius, and black is just positionally winning here. When this move was first played by Capablanca in 1914, it was labeled a clear positional error, it shredded black's position, and so forth. As always, the truth is somewhere in between. When you have two sides of hysteria, typically you want to look for the nuggets of truth that typically each side has. C4 is not a bad move at all, so this is a very positionally committal move. Because it opens up that d4 square as an eternal outpost for white's knight, and that's certainly a strength for white. But this is also a strength for black in that it gains space, so now the d3 square is unavailable for white's pieces. His bishop is on the dark square, so putting his pawns on light squares increases the scope of this bishop, so now it has a pretty decent square on c5 it hop to. It immobilizes the b-pawn as a target, so now when black plays rook a b8, white can't simply respond with b3, because that pawn on c4 is cramping that out. Do these factors balance out? I think they balance out very precisely. I think this c4 doesn't change the evaluation of the position. It just changes the style of play. If black wants to maintain more of a flexible position, queen e6 is perfectly viable. And this is also completely equal in my opinion. There are hanging pawns, but here with the queens on and good mobilization from black, they're not a weakness just yet. White really hasn't developed any meaningful pressure against them, so it's not tying black down just yet. So the game choice doesn't change the evaluation, it changes the stakes. It's very positionally committal. But it also favors Capablanca, because he was certainly a stronger player than Bernstein. And when you're playing a weaker player, typically you want to head for more committal positions, where the evaluation tends more on your strength than on routine play. So here, Capablanca was most likely evaluating this position correctly, as c4 just being a battle of trade-offs, whereas Bernstein would probably be evaluated emotionally, like c4 is an ugly move, it has to be punished. And you can sort of see this in the way Bernstein plays against this move heading forward. Knight d4, so that's a perfectly fine move. e4 is also fine. This e4 liquidates to a draw. But psychologically, back then, after you've seen a move like c4, you wouldn't be thinking about a draw, because you think c4 is just an ugly, terrible move that needs to be positionally punished. The outpost on d4 looks strong, and it is a strength. But what is the knight on d4 accomplishing? The knight on d4 doesn't really accomplish anything strong. It blockades the pawn, but the pawn was in no danger of going anywhere, as it is. Just like with an isolated pawn, a lot of times the outpost in front of the isolated pawn is an overrated thing. You want to make sure the d-pawn can't advance, but once you've ensured that, it's much better to actually attack this pawn than blockade this pawn. So the knight in d4 looks nice, and it is nice in certain ways, but it's not accomplishing anything active. The square on d4 isn't an asset into itself. So unless white's able to create some sort of play with this knight on d4, it's more or less just sitting there. So bishop b4. This is the first step towards the abyss, this b3 move. Again, this is emotional play. This is looking at the c-pawn as a weakness rather than a potential strength. With modern eyes, we see that this is just creating a passed c-pawn for black, so queen c2, in my opinion, is better. Rook b1, just holding serve. Again, white doesn't have an advantage here, but neither is black better. This is just a balanced position where it's hard for either side to really accomplish something. But b3 gives black a hook to work with. It potentially creates a passed c-pawn, and it creates more scope for this bishop on b4, potentially. Okay, c8. Just creating a passed pawn for no good reason. One potential good line. And this is still just balanced. This isn't losing for white yet at all, because this pawn on c4 hasn't yet become passed, and it's not yet become active. So as long as white's just able to hold serve, this is still a perfectly fine position for white. But bishop bxc4 creates that potentially strong pass pawn for no good reason. c2. So in this case, the knight on c3 is strong because it's blockading that strong pass c-pawn, so black chops it off. Of course, just a quick note. That loses, so the rook has to go back to c2. c3, not mandatory. Knight f4 is another way of playing, using this pawn on c4 to support a knight on d3. And black has a little bit of an edge here, but c3 is certainly the natural move, just because this pawn looks so strong. Double against the pawn, that's correct. Obviously, Bernstein would be happy with a draw at this point. But now he suddenly starts playing for active play, I guess. G3 making Luft for the king. We see the final tactic of the game. If white had made some Luft, none of this madness would have happened. And white can just hold in place and ask black to make progress. This is certainly a little bit better for black just because this pawn on c3 is so strong. But as long as white just holds serve, it's fairly difficult for black to make progress. Knight b5, this doesn't accomplish anything that puts the blockade at risk. Rook c5, knight c3, this is just missing the final tactic. Knight d4, again, white has to hold serve. One potential line. And h3, finally making Luft for the king. Notice that knight b4 doesn't work here. And white chops the pawn off the board. So, in this position, black is certainly better. This pawn on c3 is so very strong. But as long as white plays solidly, white can at least make black prove it. Whereas knight c3, this is a famous tactic. This is one position that ends up in tactical puzzles more than any other, along with a few others. But very simple. Queen b2. Heavily overpraised. I mean, this being able to see it from this position is fairly impressive. But the final position here, queen b2, is just a basic fork combining the vulnerability of the back rank. The queen took just to allow the pretty mate. And notice. Notice on queen e1, just queen x c3. And that is gone. Or if rook c2, queen b1. Notice that rook d1 itself is poor because of mate. But you just take the rook. So, decent game from Capablanca. In my opinion, it's vastly overpraised. Of course, the key position is this here. c4. It's a fairly rare concept because quite typically, advancing the c-pawn like this is something desirable for white. That's something that white typically wants to provoke out of the hanging pawns. But there are some exceptions. There are concrete positions like this where the space gained by the pawn and the creation of a target on b2 completely negates the weaknesses created by moving this pawn to c4. And there are weaknesses. I mean, the pawn on d5 is weak. The square on d4 is weak. Those don't go away just because black has his own assets. It's pitting two sets of assets against each other. So it's pitting the weakness of d5, the pawn on d5, and the square of d4 against the extra space this pawn grabs, plus the creation of the target of d2. It's a trade-off, just like a lot of things in chess. So c4 doesn't change the valuation of the position. It changes the character of the position. And it creates a different set of problems. And here, because Bernstein was a weaker player than Capablanca, obviously, Capablanca was happy to set him those different set of problems. It was a non-routine position for those times, so it would have been fairly difficult for Bernstein to deal with it. So, classic game. This is one of those games that you just have to have in your mental database to think about. We'll continue our examination of how to play with hanging pawns tomorrow with something a bit more classical, some aggressive attacking games. My name is John. I'll see you then.